G'day and welcome back to another episode of Endo Untangled. My name is Dr Alicia Macro. I am a GP with a special interest in endometriosis and pelvic pain. And I'm joined, as always, by Cherie Noble, accredited exercise physiologist and endo navigator and friend and co-nerd. And we're very excited today to be bringing you Dr Deena Emera from the United States. Dr Deena is an evolutionary biologist whose work focuses on the evolution of pregnancy, uterus and menstruation. She is the author of an excellent book called A Brief History of the Female Body, where she reframes women's biology through evolution, asking not what is wrong with the female body, but why it evolved the way it did. Dr Deena, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you so much. I am very excited to chat with you both.
So excited to have you on. One of the goals that we have in this podcast is to help bring some curiosity around women's health. And so, Deena, when I read your book, I just became so excited about what you might be able to bring to a conversation about women's health that I stalked you quite hard across a number of different social platforms and begged you to come on the podcast because it's so wonderful to bring a new perspective to women's health. And as an evolutionary biologist, you're certainly the first one of those we've had on the podcast. Can you tell us a little bit about what brought you into your area of science and also what prompted you to write this amazing book?
Well, thank you for the compliments on my book. So what brought me to evolutionary biology? Really, it started with a fascination with human evolution. And it literally started on trips to the zoo. And I would just spend all my time at the primate exhibits, looking at different monkeys, looking at other apes, and looking into their faces and just being so amazed that, I could see the similarities between us and those primates. Yet I could also see that they were obviously a totally different species. So that I was really obsessed with that. And, so I've had quite a journey. I actually started my career as a high school biology teacher. I did that for a few years. So I've always had an interest in teaching and talking about science. That has been there from the beginning as well. Then I thought I was going to be an anthropologist and I went on a Neanderthal dig and just did some really cool stuff in a master's program. But that really sort of directed me more towards evolution, broader mechanisms of evolution and how does evolution work? And, how do big changes in bodies happen over time? And so as I started my PhD, I honestly, it was just luck. I happened to join a lab where the principal investigator of the lab was focused on the uterus. And it probably wasn't a coincidence. I mean, I have a uterus. At that time I was, thinking about having my first kid. So it was obviously something that I, was on my mind. And so it probably wasn't a coincidence that I joined that lab. But anyway, that's... So, I ended up really focused on female biology. And actually, it was while I was getting my PhD in that lab, and I was studying really hard. I talk about this in my book. I was studying really hard for my qualifying exams and learning, so many fascinating things about our reproductive biology, about the uterus in particular. And as all of this was happening, I was pregnant with my first baby. And it just... I had this moment where I was like, I have to share this information with other women. Obviously I recognize that not everyone is destined to be an evolutionary biologist studying the reproductive system. And, I do try to make the book as accessible as possible because that really was my goal. I want other women to understand their bodies better. Now that was, I didn't write the book right away. So it took many years from when I first had the idea to when I actually wrote it and published it. But actually the journey continues. So what I really want to do next is write a version of this book for girls. because I just feel like there's so, especially for girls, I mean, it's true for women too, but there's just so many competing messages and honestly, really negative messages about our bodies. And I'm just tired of it, and I like really truly view the female body as just so amazing. And yes, like we're going to get into, the topic of menstruation, it can be a drag. I'm a woman. I recognize that it's hard to deal with, especially if you're someone who has endometriosis, as an example, or heavy menstrual bleeding, or all the things that women across the world face. But I also think it's amazing, like when you actually understand why they evolved and what purpose they have. I think it's just, honestly, it's like, so amazing to me. And it makes me feel very proud of my body. And when I see girls and women, just hating on their bodies, it makes me so defensive and angry. So anyway, this is quite a journey that I'm on. But
what a beautiful story. Like, what an absolute beautiful journey that's so interwoven and connected. And
Thank you.
And it feels like, and you're so passionate about, I love like talking to people who are really passionate about their work and what they do. And it just sounds like that evolutionary background and where you stemmed from, has set such a beautiful foundation for the work you're doing. And I love hearing what you're saying, particularly around girls and how we feel about our body. And, let's come in. And we talk to our patients about, being curious, like let's be curious and fascinated. And, even with let's try and look at things through a different lens and a different perspective to help understand, like let's have an understanding of what's going on and then how we can move forward with this. So how do you think this evolutionary perspective can lend itself to understanding what's going on now?
I mean, that's a great question, because as an evolutionary biologist, I think a lot about the context in which our bodies evolved, which is very different from the modern context that we're living in. And so I actually think that many of the health challenges that we face as women are really driven by this mismatch between what our bodies are expecting, given, the millions of years of evolution that they've been through, and what they're exposed to now. And I think that understanding can inform just better choices. I mean, I hate to be the person to say it's all about lifestyle and it's all about diet, because
but they are
I think
factors, aren't they? That, we can say it's not all about it, is it? But it's part of the picture.
And it's something that we can control to a degree.
To a degree.
Yes. And I do think a lot of it is in our control. I think some of it is not. I mean, maybe we'll get into this later, but, exposures to toxins in the environment, there's some of that you can control and some of it that you can't. And, just where you live in the world can have such a tremendous impact on your health. And, especially for girls, I mean, they can't choose where they live, young girls, right? Maybe you have a little bit more choice when you're an adult, but so I think it's important to understand how important environment is. But I also recognize that it's very difficult to change everything about your environment to make that mismatch go away. And so, but just something is, so a lot of what I'm working on now is actually menopause. And a lot of the people in my community know, not other scientists, but other moms, as an example, know that I do a lot of work on menopause. And so on the sidelines of the soccer game, they'll come up and say, hey, I'm having terrible hot flashes. What should I do? And, again, we talked about this a little bit about this before. I'm not a doctor, so I hate giving people medical advice, or I'm not comfortable with it. But I am very comfortable saying, well, wait a minute, let's take a step back. Like, how much are you sleeping at night? Because often some of these basic things that our bodies need to be healthy and thrive are not there. Sleep, food, let's start there before you intervene medically, right?
Because these are biological functions that obviously, again, someone like yourself fully understands how we were designed to live and with these rhythms and rest and repair, and how we live now versus how we are designed to live are potentially a bit of a mismatch there, which, again, then leads into how that affects hormones and menstrual cycles, which we want to get into.
Deena, in your
Absolutely.
book, you talk about or you compare a girl in the ice age, an ice age girl, and start thinking about what her life would have been like, what it would have been like for her to get her first period, for example. And I'm just interested in your thoughts about this ice age girl who might be 13 or 14 or 15 or 16 even, getting her period, what her menstrual life might look like compared to a young teenager now. Could you take us through what those differences might be?
Yeah, absolutely. So I mentioned the ice age girl in the book. I would say, we don't know exactly what her reproductive life was like, because it's very hard. She was in the past, right? So a lot of what anthropologists and evolutionary biologists do is they will look at modern women today who live more like she did. So anthropologists who study hunter-gatherers who still live on the planet today. And, so there's things about their lifestyle that are similar. So for, over 95% of human history, we were hunter-gatherers. We hunted animals for meat and we walked around gathering food. We were not using birth control. We were not going to the doctor. We were doing a lot of walking. We don't know exactly what that ice age girl experienced, but we can guess what she experienced based on what modern hunter-gatherer girls experience today. And so anthropologists who have studied modern hunter-gatherers, what they have found is, number one, they get their first period later than girls today. So that's a really interesting topic that we could spend hours on, because the age of menarche, the first period, has really gone down in the last couple of 100 years. And what's prompted so much research and speculation about why. Another interesting direction of research is the number of cycles that modern hunter-gatherers have, and the number of cycles that we can presume our ice age girl had over the reproductive lifespan. So obviously they have many fewer than we do, and it's because they're pregnant or nursing for much of their reproductive life. And, people who study this really think about, again, what our bodies evolved to do, which is to, once you hit puberty, it's really meant to either be pregnant or nursing those babies for much of the reproductive life. And so there's an anthropologist, Beverly Strassman, who was very interested in this particular question. And she studied this hunter-gatherer group, I think in Mali. And what she found is that women in that tribe get about 100 periods in their lifetime, in contrast to women in the West who experience more like 400. So it's just a huge difference in the number of cycles that we have here versus in those modern hunter-gatherers, and probably in those women from the past.
What
one
implications? I was going to say, what are the implications of that?
One obvious implication is a higher incidence of breast cancer and other reproductive cancers, because every time we cycle, we get these spikes and drops of reproductive hormones, and those hormones are doing things in the body. And one of the things they're doing is they're getting the peaks of estrogen are getting cells to replicate. And we know that when cells are replicating, that's really the the time when a cancer can emerge, right? The more opportunities you give for cells to divide, basically, the higher the chance that something will go wrong during a cell division and a cancer might start. And we see that. I mean, when you look at modern hunter-gatherers, they have a much lower incidence of breast cancer than we do. And there's lots of other data that sort of support this idea that more cycles and more hormones translates to a higher risk of breast cancer. For example, women who get their first period really early, or women who go through menopause really late, just because of that small increase in the reproductive lifespan, their risk of a reproductive cancer, really the breast is the main one, the risk is higher in those women. That's one obvious health consequence of more cycling. Now, obviously, the solution is not telling everyone to spend their entire reproductive life pregnant or breastfeeding. Like, I recognize that that's not going to be the new fad, but it's something that's important to understand, obviously.
I think that we hear a lot about it's natural to have a period. So I think it, for want of a better term, myth bust that a little bit, where we've got people who don't, and we totally respect everyone's decisions, but there's like that information around, we're meant to have periods. But from an evolutionary perspective, it's like you were saying, we're designed to have babies. And when we're breastfeeding, we don't have that cycling.
Absolutely.
Yes.
Deena, what are your thoughts on why an Ice Age girl might have got her first period in her, say, mid-teens compared to the girls now who, and we know that they're getting their period earlier and earlier? Are there thoughts on what might be changing?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of thoughts. I don't know that we have the definitive answer. And my hypothesis is that there's probably more than one factor involved. We for sure know that changes in diet are contributing to it. That Ice Age girl had a very different lifestyle than girls today. So they were moving a lot. They had lots of fiber in their diet. They had much lower fat diets. Kids today, and, I have 4 kids, so I see what they want to eat and what they do end up eating if I don't provide like healthy food for them. And it's not good. And, and unfortunately, it often, the cheapest food is the food that tastes really good. So I think, and we worked out some of the science, but it's as simple as our bodies are not robots. Our genes don't decide like the day that we're going to get our first period. There's a lot of factoring in what's happening to that particular girl. And if she's getting a lot of food and she's packing on the weight, that's basically a signal to her body, like this body is ready to have babies. And scientists have worked out some of the signaling that's involved in that. And that's also consistent with, we know that overweight girls, obese girls get their first periods earlier. So I think diet and exercise, we move a lot less than that Ice Age girl did. For example, we know that, not everyone does, but in general, we move less. The girls that are, those elite athletes, those gymnasts who are really working their bodies hard, those girls actually get their first periods later. And they might, after they've gotten their period, they might stop cycling. So there's definitely exercise and diet, I think, are part of the answer to this question. And I want to say that's exactly what you would expect, right? Like our bodies actually evolved to factor in environmental factors like the quality of the diet, just the number of calories. Is this body going to be able to support a pregnancy and support nursing? That it's incredibly energetically demanding to nurse a baby, not the way we do it here for a few months, but to nurse that baby for a few years. So yeah, I would say diet, lifestyle for sure, a part of the answer. There's a lot of discussion about whether other factors are involved. And I think that those data are not as clear. And here I'm referring to toxic chemicals in the environment, specifically chemicals that mimic our reproductive hormones or block them from doing what they're supposed to be doing in the body. So there's a growing body of research, I think, on, things like BPA and phthalates. And
so we're talking about plastics, Deena.
Plastics. Yep.
It's so hard to avoid, isn't it? It's ubiquitous. It's everywhere.
It's everywhere. Anything you put on your skin, anything you clean your house with, anything you put your food in. I hate to be alarmist because I don't yet think that we have enough. We know that some of those toxins contribute to infertility, other reproductive issues that women have. I'm not so sure yet about the early periods, like the early menarche.
It's a complex system, isn't it? It's not just about the plastics. It's not just about the lifestyle. There's a lot of things going on and it's hard to pull them apart. But again, coming back, we've talked about on the podcast about the circle of control and we can't always control government policy around plastic and what's in our environment. We can control some things around our diet and the way that we're moving and some aspects of what we're doing with the plastics in our homes. But certainly good to reflect on what might be different. Deena, what I'm hoping to move on to is another part that makes me really excited to talk about is digging into periods a little bit more. And I think if you ask an average person on the street which animals have periods or which animals menstruate, I think most people would say, yeah, lots of animals menstruate. But I think that's a massive misconception. Tell us about that, Deena. Which species are having periods and which species aren't having periods?
Yeah, that's one of my favorite topics.
Same.
Actually, a very small number of mammals menstruate. So it's on the order of like 80 species, which sounds like a lot, but there are over 5,000 species of mammals. So it's really, 1-2% of mammals bleed.
Wow, that's not a lot.
It's very few.
Yeah. So there's obviously a reason why.
Yeah, I think so. I don't know that we have the definitive answer, but I definitely have some strong opinions about it. I think the reason why people think that more species, maybe perhaps potentially all mammals menstruate is because of dogs. So dogs are not one of the species that menstruate, but they do bleed. And I think first of all, dogs are a very popular pet. And so if you've ever experienced, your own dog bleeding, I think people assume that that's a period, and it actually isn't. It's, it happens, the bleeding happens at a completely different part of the menstrual cycle, or of the estrus cycle, I should say, in a dog, because they don't have menstruation. So in a woman, menstruation happens at the end of the cycle, or I guess on day one is when it technically starts, but it's triggered by a drop in progesterone. Progesterone is this hormone that's made by the ovaries. It's really important for pregnancy. Our bodies make it before we get pregnant. If you don't get pregnant, then it drops. And it's actually the drop in progesterone that triggers a period. In dogs, that's not when the bleeding happens. So it happens actually when estrogen is really high. And for whatever reason in dogs, because I don't think this happens in a lot of other species, the high estrogen causes like blood to leak out, like leak through blood vessels. And some of that blood actually makes it into the cavity of the uterus and it comes out of the vagina. But it's like a completely different phenomenon. Menstruation is not just losing blood, but it's also losing, the very superficial layer of the uterus. So it's completely different, but I think it could explain this misconception that like all animals menstruate.
So what's really happening in the menstrual cycle? Like you kind of touched on that, and I'm thinking.
Yes, and what I love about in your book is you talk about what's happening in the brain, the uterus and the ovaries. And I think it's really important to remember that these hormones are active in all sorts of different tissues in the body.
Yeah, that's exactly right. There's like, it's almost, I think of it as a conversation happening between the brain, the ovaries, and the uterus. And the way that these organs are communicating with each other or talking to each other are with these hormones. I mentioned progesterone, I mentioned estrogen. There are some other hormones that are part of the conversation, but basically the brain can send a hormone out, and, it can travel in the blood and travel, basically signal to another part of the body to do something. Estrogen. I mean, estrogen's a really interesting hormone because it's signaling to you name a tissue and it's probably signaling to it, including to the brain. So, these hormones are signaling to other organs in this sort of brain, ovary, uterus axis that I'm talking about, but they also signal to lots of other tissues. So, the brain sends a hormone out that basically gets this whole sort of cycle move. It's hard to know where to start because it really is a cycle, but you kind of have to start somewhere. So starting with the brain, the brain releases a hormone that it releases it in pulses. That is a hormone that it's called, I hate to get into fancy words, but it's called gonadotropin releasing hormone, but it's basically tells a different part of the brain to, these are hormones maybe your listeners may have heard of, luteinizing hormone. It's also known as LH, and follicle stimulating hormone, which is FSH. So these are hormones that are really important for your cycles. It tells a different part of the brain to release those two hormones. Then those two hormones basically talk to the ovaries and tell the ovaries to release estrogen in the first half of the cycle. And, estrogen is getting produced in higher and higher levels, and then it reaches a threshold, and that causes ovulation. Without getting into too much of the details, ovulation happens, and then a different hormone takes over in the ovaries called progesterone. And that's really, so, the ovaries are producing lots of hormones. Estrogen, progesterone are the two big ones. Those hormones are really signaling to the uterus and orchestrating all of these changes that happen over the course of the menstrual cycle. So in the first half of the cycle, estrogen is basically telling the lining of the uterus, the endometrium, to sort of make more of itself. So, think of, it's like building up a thicker lining. And then ovulation happens and progesterone becomes the dominant signal. And progesterone tells all of those cells that just were generated in response to estrogen. Progesterone's telling those cells to basically transform, is the word I like to use, into this other cell type, really, that the analogy that I've always liked is it's turning, that transformation of the lining of the uterus, it's like going from soil to bricks. So it becomes like more of like a wall. And that it's, maybe that's not the best analogy because, that wall is really important to interact with a baby, a potential baby.
We were talking about this. Sorry to interrupt, Deena. Before we came into the studio this morning, I was
fascinated by this
we were
topic.
having a conversation and we were trying to think of our own analogy, and I came up with the idea of a force field. I don't know what you think about a force field. Yeah. I've got some kids really into Star Wars at home, just that sort of get that protect. It's almost like it's transforming into a protective layer that protects the woman.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, that tissue, once it's transformed, it's doing a lot of things.
I don't think we realize that, do we? Yeah. And just listening to you talk, I feel like there's like this estrogen, progesterone. It sounded like a performance. And there's act one.
Yeah.
Act one is estrogen, and then act two is now progesterone coming in.
that.
It's like
Totally.
Yeah. And then
Act 3 is the force field. And the technical term for that is decidualization, isn't it? And I think that's important.
Which I love that word.
It's an important word to bring into the conversation, I think. Yeah.
Yes. Decidualization. People may have heard of the deciduous tree. There's definitely connections to that, because these cells, when they go through the process of decidualization, they become decidual cells. And I think the reason they got that name is because just like the leaves of a deciduous tree will drop off the tree during the winter, these decidual cells basically drop out of the uterus during menstruation, not only during menstruation, but also after pregnancy. So, and because these decidual cells do a lot of talking with blood vessels in the area, when they quote unquote fall out, any tissues, blood vessels that they were interacting very intimately with will also fall out. And so that's why there's blood, because those cells are just, they're we call them fibroblast cells. They're just regular cells. They're not in blood vessels or anything, but because they communicate with blood vessels, nearby. And those blood vessels, by the way, they really ramped up production when estrogen was responsible for Act 1. So they really, they grew and they expanded. And so all of that, as the decidua falls out during a period, those blood vessels, the blood vessels have to sort of constrict and come out. That's where the blood comes from.
And I'm not sure if I'm disrupting the performance here, but like, why do we have to do that? Like, why do we have that period and that shedding?
Yeah, so I think this is the heart of the question, because back to your earlier question about which species menstruate, most mammals don't menstruate. Obviously, most mammals are perfectly capable of having babies. So you don't need to have a period to successfully reproduce. That's not a requirement by any means. And I
just think that's such a mic drop moment.
Isn't it? So why do we have to do it?
Exactly. Why do we have to do it? Yeah. It must be important.
It must be important. Yeah. Can you shed some light on why it's important?
Shed some light.
I know, pun intended. Boom. Yeah. There's performances all around today.
When I was getting my PhD and we were studying the uterus, we were really interested in this question. And I did a lot of investigation. Really, like at the place an evolutionary biologist often starts is to look at, all the animals that have the trait you're interested in. And so we were looking at the monkeys and the apes, which all get periods. But then there's some other species that are in completely different parts of the mammalian tree that get periods. So there's a few bats that get them. There's an animal called the elephant shrew, which is related to elephants. It doesn't look like an elephant, except it does kind of have a cute little long snout. It looks a little bit like a trunk, but it's tiny. It's a very small mammal. So they get periods. Anyway, so it turns out that there's one other animal, the spiny mouse, which was really surprising. It actually was discovered somewhat recently that they get periods. But it's so surprising because there's thousands of species of rodents and only one of them has been shown to menstruate. So it's just fascinating, this very strange distribution of animals that get periods. Anyway, so we were trying to understand, why do these animals get periods? It turns out that all of these animals also basically decidualize their uterus. So that transformation we've been talking about, that's controlled by progesterone, they also transform their uterus into a decidua, but they do that before they're even pregnant. So this is like the key difference between a menstruating mammal and a non-menstruating mammal, which again comprises the vast majority of mammals. The key difference, and I think the crux of this question, why do we menstruate? Like, this is the heart of the where we're going to find the answer. All of these species that menstruate also decidualize their endometrium every single cycle. Most mammals do not do that. Most mammals, they will transform their endometria into a decidua, but they only do that if they've gotten pregnant. So let's talk about I'm thinking of an animal that would be a good example. Let's think about a regular mouse. Regular mouse, a little mouse that's, running around in your yard. It obviously reproduces very well. They have many, many babies over their lifespan. They have large litters. They differentiate they transform their endometria, but the time that they do that is different from when a menstruating mammal does it. The little mouse will copulate. It will, the eggs will be fertilized. The fertilized eggs, because they have large litters, so the fertilized eggs will travel down into their uterus, basically, and they'll start to implant. And it's that process of implantation that triggers the lining of the uterus to become the decidual cells that we've been talking about. It's the implantation that triggers decidualization. Very different from what happens in a menstruating mammal. Menstruating mammals, all menstruating mammals, we actually call it spontaneous decidualization, because there's no baby needed. All that you need is the reproductive hormones that are, we talked about some of them, that are cycling in this predictable way. And the endometrium in the menstruating mammals, they differentiate or transform at very predictable parts of the cycle. Really, when progesterone has peaked is when it starts to happen. So there's something about progesterone in particular in these species that is inducing this decidualization of the uterus. So there's one last piece that I have to explain. The thing about decidual cells, the thing about the decidua, is that its lifeline is progesterone. Those cells cannot remain, they cannot stay alive without progesterone. So if progesterone isn't there and they've transformed, they die. And so this is the thing. A menstruating mammal, every cycle is transforming their endometrium into a decidua, we call it. So they're going through decidualization, spontaneous decidualization. But if the female doesn't get pregnant, her progesterone levels plummet. And since those cells need progesterone when they're in that state, those cells start to die, and the tissues that they were communicating with, the blood vessels and whatnot, also come out. In a mouse that doesn't menstruate, a house mouse, the endometrium never differentiates. It does only when the female's pregnant. And when the female gives birth, it's just the same thing, actually. When you give birth, it's obviously much more elaborate, but when you give birth, there's a lot of blood, and those decidual cells are coming out the same way that they come out at the end of a menstrual cycle.
So, Deena, it sounds like the key difference is in menstruating mammals, humans, primates, elephant shrews, and bats. Yeah. We need them on a T-shirt.
We do, yeah.
That the mother controls the decidualization, the force field process, whereas in all the other mammals, which is the vast majority of other mammals, the baby is triggering the decidualization, which is why they don't shed because the endometrium stays there, or whatever tissue that is stays there until there's a pregnancy, which causes a huge amount of work for the females who are having regular menstrual cycles compared to those who don't need to worry about that, which must mean from an evolutionary perspective that that's important, that there's something about that process which is important. What do you think that is?
Yeah, that's a great question. One thing that we know that the decidual cells do is we think of them as sensors. So we think of them as little biosensors that, and this we know experimentally, these cells, once they've transformed into decidual cells, they can actually sense the quality of the embryo that's trying to implant. So, there's been lots of experiments in the lab. There are a few labs that study this. They have shown that if you put a developmentally impaired embryo with decidual cells, the decidual cells actually induce this stress response and prevent that embryo from implanting. And it's not just preventing unhealthy embryos from implanting, it's also encouraging healthy embryos to implant. And some of the mechanisms of this have been worked out. So I think, I think there is evidence to support this hypothesis. I would like to see more, especially comparative work in other species. But we know that in humans, those decidual cells are doing something really important, which is basically acting like a quality control. It's this complex system of quality control. And that is super important for the female animal who's investing. Anyone who's been through a pregnancy knows just how energetically it takes a lot of energy to have a baby, to go through a pregnancy, to nurse the baby once it's born. It is like hugely taxing on the female body, and it takes a lot of work. And so in species that do that have, because not all babies are as demanding as a human baby, in terms of time and energy, in species that demands, where the babies are demand as much as they do in our species, we actually would predict, like evolutionary theory would predict this exact thing to evolve, which is let's do as good of a job as we can. It's not a perfect system, but let's try and make the embryos that we invest in the healthiest that we can. And if those embryos aren't healthy, let's figure out a system to prevent those embryos, because imagine, and we see this in women, actually, there's all these studies showing that women who have problems with that decidualization, they get pregnant a lot. So actually they're super fertile. They get pregnant, but then many of them have miscarriages very late. So at a much later during a pregnancy than women who don't have problems with the decidualization process. So that decidualization process is really important for the last piece of this that I think is important to say is that humans, for whatever reason, and we think some of the other primates, make a lot of developmentally impaired embryos. Like there's a lot of chromosomal problems. There's a lot of developmental problems. Many, we know this, many human pregnancies end very early. So reproduction seems to be really hard in our species, but we think maybe this mechanism evolved to just, it's basically for the mothers. It's a way for mothers to enhance their reproductive success, because that's the currency in evolution, is who's the most successful at having babies. What are their traits? And it's those traits that get propagated over time and become, a species specific trait. We all human women do this. And, this is a trait that evolved a long time ago.
So, Deena, just to close, we knew that we wouldn't have enough time today. We could talk for hours, but just to close, clearly this is an incredibly important process to us. Otherwise, it wouldn't have evolved, and it's a fairly uncommon thing that we have to go through. And it would appear that a problem like endometriosis is an unfortunate health issue that can happen as a result of having periods, and the more you have, the more likely there are to be problems with it. Do the other species that don't have periods, do you know if they can get endometriosis?
I don't think there's any evidence of endometriosis in a non-menstruating species. There is evidence of endometriosis in other apes. I don't think that it's as common in those other animals. I think it's more common in humans, but there is evidence. So no endometriosis in non-menstruating species. Cases of endometriosis certainly have been found in other primates. And it makes sense. I think, the conventional wisdom is that one of the ways that you can get an endometrial lesion is when, most menstrual blood travels down through the vagina, out the body. But I think there's evidence that some of that menstrual blood and the tissue that comes with it can travel the other direction. So that's the way that it could get out of the reproductive tract and into the, into the cavity that where the ovaries are, where, other organ systems are. Without menstruation, it's unclear how the endometrial tissue would get to those locations. And that's very consistent with sort of what we see. Species that don't menstruate don't have endometriosis. So yeah, it's an unfortunate sort of consequence of menstruating. I will say, back to the question about the Ice Age girl, she didn't menstruate as much as we do, right? So the chances that she's going to develop a lesion, and the pain, we didn't even talk about PMS and pain as part of this conversation, because I think that is another really big difference. Sorry, I should have mentioned it before, but that's another big difference, I think, between that Ice Age girl and us, is all the pain associated with the period. Do
you think she wouldn't have had as much pain?
I don't think she would have had as much pain.
Wow.
And I have a hypothesis on why. And it has to do with the levels of reproductive hormones in hunter-gatherers like the Ice Age girl, and in modern hunter-gatherers. They have much lower levels of reproductive hormones. And so when those hormones drop at the end of a reproductive cycle, at the end of a reproductive lifespan, so symptoms of menopause, I think, are also implicated in, again, diet and lifestyle. I mean, I hate to go back to it because I sound like I'm nagging you. I'm nagging your listeners.
But is that why you think they've got, is that, because what I wanted to ask you is, why do you think they have less levels of these hormones? And I know we're pushing time, but I really want to answer this question.
Yeah. I mean, this is well studied. Again, it goes back to diet and lifestyle. So, we don't eat a lot of fiber. We have diets full of fats. And, we know that certain factors in our diet are responsible for, and lifestyle, right? The girls who exercise a lot, those elite athletes, have much lower levels of reproductive hormones. And so what's the connection between higher reproductive, a higher peak of estrogen and progesterone and PMS symptoms or menopause symptoms? I like to think of it as, you look at the slope of the drop, much steeper drop in Western women who reach a higher peak. And it's almost like your body's going through hormone withdrawal, right? Because you had such high levels and then they drop very quickly, and it's hard for the body to adjust to that. compared to a hunter-gatherer who starts off with much lower levels, her drop is much more gradual. And so she's not really having those, I mean, I think of it as like withdrawal symptoms, like
extraordinary.
It's fascinating. And it totally tracks. Modern hunter-gatherers report much fewer PMS symptoms. Really the menopause symptoms, it's the same idea. They don't report as many symptoms. And again, I think it has to do with, what their bodies are just adapted to lower levels of reproductive hormones. And so when they drop at menopause, their bodies are like, okay, not a big deal. Whereas our bodies are like, oh, where's my estrogen?
Don't we say that
There's
on
a
the
t-shirt? Where's my estrogen?
Dr. Deena Emera, thank you so much. We knew we would love this conversation, and I have loved this conversation so much. I hope we get to catch up again at some point in the future.
I feel like there's so much more that we really want to pick your brain about.
Yeah, thank you so
come
much.
Back.
Please come to Australia and visit us.
Yeah.
I would love that.
We'll take
I've
you
never
shopping.
been to Australia.
Oh, all the best.